Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
An awful lot of what we've heard from Chequers sounds quite similar to what Labour's been asking for over recent months. So can we expect a warm and generous response from Labour's shadow Brexit Secretary, Sir Keir Starmer?
Andrew, let me start by being warm and generous. Can I just say, well done, England. What a fantastic result, fantastic team, and I can't believe we're in the last four. As for Chequers,
yes.
I'm afraid it's got fudge written all over it. If you look at the facilitated customs arrangement, the sort of heart of this, it's a rebadging of the partnership, and it's based on the idea that at the border you can distinguish between goods that are going to stay in the UK and those going to the EU. It's unworkable. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. So this is a fudge.
But the overall plan is very similar to what you have told me in the past that you wanted. In other words, there is going to be a common rule book when it comes to goods and so forth. There is an attempt, as it were, to stay inside something very close to a common market when it comes to goods. There is going to be much easier migration from one side to the other, perhaps, than people thought. The European Court is going to be pushed very much to one side. And there are specific promises when it comes to labour law, regulations, all the things that Labour were worried about were going to be undermined. They're not going to be undermined.
Well, Andrew, we've argued for a comprehensive customs union with the EU. In order to avoid that, the Prime Minister's gone to these extraordinary lengths to come up with this bureaucratic nightmare, which is not going to work. So she doesn't come anywhere near what we're proposing.
So to be absolutely clear, you want to be inside the single market and the customs union?
Well, on the customs union, we've said for a long time there should be a comprehensive customs union with the EU. Now, on Monday week, the customs bill is in Parliament. So we've now got two propositions. We've got the Labour proposition, which I think has the majority support in Parliament, and the Prime Minister's new proposition. Let's put it to a vote. I challenge the Prime Minister. Put it to a vote and see where the majority is in Parliament on a customs union. So you think, to be absolutely clear, she should bring her Chequers compromise to the House of Commons, enshrine it in law and put it in front of MPs? She's got the opportunity Monday week. We've got amendments down saying have a customs union with the EU. That's got cross-party support. There are amendments down from Tory rebels on this. Put it to a vote so that we can actually see where the majority in Parliament is on this.
We've got something called a labour mobility framework now from the government, which is a system which sounds like there's no visas for people who've got jobs to come from the EU and work here and vice versa, which again is quite similar to what you suggested about easy movement of people after the EU. Would you go further? Would you give EU citizens priority over people from other countries?
Well, Andrew, we'll have to see what the detail is on the Prime Minister's proposal, because she's not been clear. There is a white paper later in the week, so we'll see what that says. What we've said is there's going to have to be an end of freedom of movement as we have it now, but we're going to have movement that works for the economy and for our communities. And the economy needs people to be able to cross borders to work, to cross borders into the EU and from the EU into here. There's no better example than the NHS. So I think any sensible proposal going forward is going to see an ability of people who are working either here or in the EU to be able to do that. We also need, of course, to recognise that we're a country that has always believed that families should be able to live together and to reunite, and we should welcome students. So you get the component parts of a sensible approach.
My question is specifically whether citizens of EU countries should have a priority status in any future immigration system to this country.
That'll obviously have to be part of the negotiation.
That's something you can tell me here and now whether you think should happen or not.
Well, it's going to have to be part of the negotiation, but I think inevitably, if you want a very good deal with the EU, which we do want and which we need, that comes with the idea that will be,
yes, they should have
treatment for EU citizens in that way.
They should have specially advantageous status as
far
as you're concerned.
I'm only hesitating because it's part of the negotiation, but I accept the principle that if you want the right deal with the EU, and we do, that is going to involve preferential treatment for EU citizens.
Theresa May, I mean, I don't speak for Theresa May in any sense, but she has had a very difficult job, clearly, with her cabinet. She's been jostling different cabinet members, and she has come up with this new proposal. Now, if the opposition said, do you know what, it's quite close to what we think, we will back you in these talks, she'd be in a much, much stronger position with Brussels.
But, Andrew, she hasn't met our demands. We've been clear, you need a comprehensive customs union, and you need a single market deal with shared institutions, shared regulation. She's come up with a fudge on customs. It is a fudge. It's going to unravel. She's going to have to
Everything
move again.
This is a fudge.
And on the free trade area that she's got for goods and agricultural products, well, fine, that's a step in the right direction. But then it comes with the pretense that you can have free trade agreements with other countries in the world on goods and agricultural products where there's going to be some variance. So there's an unreality about the position she's landed in.
Nothing in this sublunary world is perfect. And clearly she's had to make lots of changes.
Yes.
The problem that you have, can I suggest, is the same as the problem that a lot of Brexit critics in the Tory party also have, which is if you bring this down in the House of Commons, and your suggestion about a vote would be a way of doing that, then you drive this country closer to the very thing that you have said would be completely intolerable and impossible, which is no deal.
Well, no deal is intolerable. What we can't say is that this fudge is therefore good enough. It's not going to last. We've set out a clear position on the customs union. Let's just vote on it, because if the majority thinks we should have a comprehensive customs union with the EU in Parliament, which I believe it does, then at least that's the basis for the negotiation.
And this customs union would be the customs union, not a customs union. It would be the customs union.
Well, Andrew, we've been around this track before. At the moment, the customs arrangements are hardwired into the membership agreement. So you need something new. We can't stay in those because they only give rights for members of the EU.
But cut through the complexities.
But just let me be clear. What we're suggesting by a customs union is a customs union that does the work of the customs union. So it simply reflects the fact that it's going to have to be in a new treaty, the EU-UK treaty. Now, I think everybody who's looked at this recognises you're going to have a new treaty. But there's no magic in this. It's simply the customs union replicated as a customs union between the EU 27 on the one side and the UK on the other.
So, as some commentators think, if the EU looks at this and says, do you know what, we can see the direction you're going, we're going to take you further, we want to blur the red lines further, we want to take you into the customs union and the single market, and you must accept the 4 freedoms. By and large, Labour would go along with that.
Well, we'll have to see what the response of the EU is. Businesses are already showing some unease with the current arrangement. We'll see what the EU says. I do want the EU to be flexible and constructive about this. I do think there's a feeling that too quickly the EU has rejected any basis for a slightly different negotiation. There's going to have to be a negotiation. Whatever the final customs union arrangement is, whatever the final single market deal is, it's going to have to be negotiated. It's going to have to be tailored to the UK, obviously with the right balance of rights and obligations. But there has to be something that removes the hard red lines of the Prime Minister on the one side and sometimes the inflexibility of the EU on the other. That's why I think it would be sensible for the Prime Minister to go with what the majority in Parliament want and then to go forward with that authority.
So for people seeing these things in very simplistic terms and saying that the Prime Minister has gone soft, as it were, in terms of the kind of Brexit she wants, the Labour position is we want to be even softer.
Well, I don't think the soft hard works. She seems to have rejected some of the fantasies of the hard or more extreme Brexiteers. That is a good thing. But in order to save face and say, but I still am outside a customs union, a single market deal, she's gone for a fudge, and that has got to be cleared up.
But a lot of people already think that this is betraying the Brexit vote.
Well, I don't think that's right. The referendum asked one question: do you want to be in the EU or out of the EU? It didn't answer the question, if you're to have a future relationship with the EU, what is that going to look like? And that's the debate that we're in the middle of at the moment.
All right. The Unite Union has said that it is open now to a second referendum, a people's vote and all the rest of it. Momentum is campaigning, or some people in Momentum are campaigning now on the same thing.
Yeah.
Under what circumstances would you think that a second plebiscite or people's vote would be acceptable?
Well, Andrew, the position of the Labour Party has been that we're not calling for a second referendum. We've focused very much on the voting.
You're not calling for it, you're letting everybody else call for it. You're standing there quietly.
We've been focusing on a meaningful vote in Parliament. But what we've also said is this, that should the Article 50 deal that the Prime Minister brings back be voted down, or worse, there's no deal, then that's a very serious situation, and we're going to have to confront it when we get there. And that Parliament must decide what happens next. And in those circumstances, it seems to me, the sensible thing is to keep all of our options on the table.
Because you've said at a private meeting with business that if Parliament decides, the power to decide, this might involve a general election or a people's vote.
Well, in the event that Article 50 is voted down, or there's no deal. That's a serious situation. Parliament should decide what happens next. And at that stage, there could be a general election, there could be other options, but all options, it seems to me, ought to be on the table because that's a situation we have to avoid at all costs.
All right. There's been a row this week, as you know, about anti-Semitism again. The international full definition for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is one that's accepted by almost everybody, by the courts, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, most Labour councils, all across the board. This is accepted, except by the Labour Party, which thinks it can do a better definition of anti-Semitism than the International Holocaust Association.
Well, I believe in the full definition. I think you're absolutely right. Councils, institutions across the country have accepted the full definition. I think that's the right position to be in. And I think.
So why do you think Labour hasn't adopted it?
Well, there's some argument as to whether Labour has or hasn't, but I would urge everybody within the Labour Party to listen to the voices that have come out in recent days and get to a position where we are supporting the full definition. I think it's really important, including the examples. We have to be very clear about our position on this.
And that's something that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and the leadership of the Labour Party have to look at and, if necessary, change their minds on.
Well, I think we need to reflect on what's been said in the last few days. And if we are not in a position of supporting the full definition, we need to get into that position and sharpish.
Admirably clear, Sir Keir Starmer. Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, coming up a little later on the Sunday Politics, Sarah Smith's guests will include the Conservative Deputy Chairman, James Cleverly, talking about that Chequers deal, and the former Labour Cabinet Minister and EU Commissioner, Peter Mandelson. That's the Sunday Politics here on BBC One at 11 o'clock. Now, let's discuss that Chequers Brexit deal further with Michael Gove, the Environment Secretary, who was one of the leaders of the Vote Leave. Is this what people voted for?
Yes. We'll be outside freedom of movement. That was a critical part of the promise that we made during the course of the referendum campaign. We'll be outside the common agricultural policy, outside the common fisheries policy. Over a huge swathe of our economy, we will have autonomy to decide what's in our best interests. We will also have a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU that will work in the interests of business. We'll also be outside the formal legal structures of the European Union. We will no longer have the European Court of Justice having direct control over what happens in this country, and we will no longer have membership of the common foreign and security policy. We'll also be outside the Justice and Home Affairs pillar, which has been part of the EU as well. So all of these structures, we're outside. That's what people voted for. This honours that vote.
And yet there was a choice in the road for the country and the government this week. Do we essentially stay quite close to the EU, or do we turn our backs and go for a big, new free trading destiny in the rest of the world? And it's the former that has won the argument.
No, I don't accept that. What we have done is to make a balanced decision. So, with respect to goods, 20% of our economy, we will agree a common rule book with the EU. But, and this is critical, should the EU develop or attempt to introduce new laws in those areas, we will have control. Our government and our parliament can decide whether or not to accept or reject them. That is wholly different from being in the European Union, where new laws are formed at a European level and every member state has to accept them. And critically, for 80% of our economy, and indeed for that part of our economy which is growing fast, will be outside the EU's regulatory orbit. And that provides a perfect balance. It means that those parts of our economy that have asked for and benefit from close access to Europe, which have integrated supply chains and just-in-time delivery, then this can deliver for them. And at the same time, we can ensure that the innovative part of our economy in services, which is growing and which will be a bigger slice of our prosperity in the future, is outside that regulatory orbit.
Was this everything you hoped for?
No, but then I'm a realist. And one of the things about politics is that you shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And one of the things about this compromise is that it unites the cabinet. Before this meeting on Friday...
In real terms, why did you have to compromise?
Well, because we need to have a united cabinet. Everyone before Friday wanted to ensure that coming out of Chequers was an agreement which honoured the referendum result, and this absolutely does that, and could also command the support of people across the country. And by making sure that we have an approach which ends free movement, which keeps us out of the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, which ends the jurisdiction of the European Court, we achieve all of the things that we campaigned for in order to ensure that we could leave the EU, but we also do so in a way which respects some of the wishes and some of the concerns of those of my colleagues who voted Remain.
is it frankly the case that the parliamentary majority wasn't there for a so-called Canada plus 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 or harder version of this deal?
Well, I think it was...
Is the parliamentary arithmetic important in this?
Of course the parliamentary arithmetic is a factor, yes, but the most important thing is to make sure that you have a deal that honours not the parliamentary arithmetic, but the arithmetic of the referendum result. 17.4 million people voted for us to be outside the structures of the European Union. That must be honoured. But of course, Parliament will have an opportunity throughout this process to vote, but I know that all of my colleagues in Parliament, however they voted, want to make sure that we have a deal that honours those red lines and at the same time works for business and helps ensure prosperity in the future.
And from now on, every cabinet minister is absolutely signed up to this. No more mutterings off stage, no more comments about polishing unpleasant objects and so forth. Everybody is going to be entirely loyal, and if they're not, they're out.
Well, the Prime Minister has been very clear about that, yes. One of the great strengths that the Prime Minister has is that she allowed us, during the course of a day, to share views, to share analyses, and to look at this proposal in detail. But at the end of it, collective responsibility reigns. And I think for the Cabinet, all of us, our responsibility is to work together in order to ensure that we can get the best possible deal for Britain. And of course, it's absolutely critical as well that that deal respects, as the Prime Minister has been crystal clear, the referendum mandate to end free movement, to get us out of the ECJ's direct jurisdiction, and to take back control of our waters and policy in the areas that matter to our economy.
Let's get back to that list then again. We have basically agreed a common market for goods, haven't we?
Yes, and some people will argue that when we entered the EEC, as it then was, what we were voting for was a common market, not a set of common political institutions. So what we're doing here is saying that for that 20% of our economy, which is goods, we want to ensure that we can operate effectively a frictionless border.
And to do that, we have signed up to this common rule book. But it's not a kind of joint rule book. It's basically a clever way of saying we accept their rules, not just for a few years, but in perpetuity, forever.
No, what it says is that we agree a common rule book, absolutely. But the UK Parliament has the right to diverge in the future. If new EU rules come up and we think, actually, do you know what? That's not right for Britain and our economy. We have the right to say no. Now,
but as the statement says, there are consequences for that.
Of course there are.
And it could be said that this is fake sovereignty. In other words, you have got the right to do something which you know will severely damage your trade, so you can't really take it.
No.
In effect, we carry on taking their rules.
No. I think that there's a key distinction here. It is the case in any trade agreement that there's an agreement about common rules and standards right at the beginning. Now, if one country wants to diverge from that agreement, of course they have the sovereign ability to do so. But that means the other country can say, well, you're no longer accepting those common rules, so therefore we have the right
exactly.
to
so
say,
it's a real bust-up.
to erect
Yeah.
a barrier. But that is no different from any trade agreement between any two sovereign entities. And the big difference is this, that Britain has the right, the British Parliament and British politicians have the right, if they believe that something is not in our interests, to say no. That was not a right that we had in the European Union.
Well, let's turn to specifics, because you sat in the same chair a little while ago and told me how incredibly frustrating it was as Environment Secretary to see these huge rafts of regulations come across your desk and be unable to change them. Civil servants saying, sorry, Minister, you can't change that because these are EU regulations. Now, this new Chequers statement says, for instance, that the UK and the EU would also agree to maintain high regulatory standards for the environment, climate change, social and employment and consumer protection, meaning we would not let standards fall beneath those current levels. In effect, that's going to carry on. Somebody doing your job, 3 down the line, is going to be having the same rules coming across their desks. And under this system, with the common rule book, it's not going to be able to say, no, I refuse to accept them.
No, I think that's a misunderstanding. We are absolutely committed, yes, to very high environmental standards. That's one of the reasons why we can be confident that a free trade agreement between Britain and the EU will work in both our interests. But more than that, we will have the ability, in particular areas, to pursue those high environmental standards in our own way. So, for example, we will be outside the Common Agricultural Policy. There are some rules that the Common Agricultural Policy imposes on our farmers that are frankly bureaucratic and counterproductive. We can get rid of those rules in a way which means that farmers can produce food more effectively while also maintaining high environmental standards. It's also the case that...
But you've signed up to a common rule book in perpetuity.
No. We've said that we can... No, we've said that we can change that when the EU comes forward with rules that we think are wrong. we have the capacity to reject them.
So there's one other thing as well. There's one other
thing as well which is important. Well, one thing that's really important to appreciate, Andrew, is that we have the sovereign right to do that, but it's also the case in other trade agreements. For example, in a trade agreement that we have concluded, the EU have included with Canada, there is a commitment on the part of the Canadians to high standards when it comes to things like the environment. Now, nobody is suggesting that Canada is not a sovereign nation, but Canada has made a decision that for economic and for trade reasons, it will accept common rules and common standards in a particular area.
Can you sit there and say that the European Court will have no influence on British public life going forward?
No, but it will end.
No, you can't, can you?
No, but there's a critical thing here. I think that the European Court, by definition, if Britain were, for the sake of argument, completely, totally independent, if Britain had absolutely no tie, no trade agreement, no dealings with Europe, the European Court of Justice would still determine the rules in our large neighbour, and that would have a bearing on the decisions that we would take about how we got our goods into their market. The critical difference, and it's important that you understand this, is that in the European Union, the European Court of Justice is in effect the UK's supreme court.
It has jurisdiction.
It has direct effect, and that jurisdiction will end.
I do understand this, but I've read it carefully, and in the future, going forward, we will take account of case law by the European Court, so it will have a lot of influence on our courts. It says so specifically.
Well, we also take account of case law in other countries' courts as well. A critical thing to bear in mind is that our judges don't sit in isolation, that the law is not something which exists in a pristine bubble. Our lawyers take account of common law jurisprudence in Canada, in Australia, in the United States. They also take account of the development of European law. And the particular area here is that the ECJ's judgments and European law will be taken into account by our courts with specific reference to trade arrangements. And as we know...
So they will still be influential?
Well, as we know...
So people saying, no more European courts in this country, that's not true. They will still be here.
No,
they will still be influential.
Andrew, no. There won't be any...
Because we'll do what they say anyway.
No, there won't be any direct jurisdiction of European courts.
I didn't say direct jurisdiction, but they will still have influence.
No. I think that you are not representing the position fairly, because the European Court of Justice's writ will end, and it is only with respect to a limited number of areas where our courts may, should they choose to, take account of EU law in the interpretation of the application of things that we have already agreed. So
I think this is fake sovereignty.
Well, I think that you're wrong. I think that is a fake question, because I think one of the points about our departure from the European Union is if you say, will we have control of our territorial waters? Of course we will. Will we have the capacity to set the rules for agriculture? Of course we will. Will we have the capacity for 80% and growing of our economy to do exactly as we wish? Yes, we will. Will it also be the case that we can set our own taxes? Will it be the case that we are outside the direct jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice? Of course we can. We can't actually set our taxes as we wish to at the moment, because VAT is set in accordance with EU rules.
Well,
so that is another area
let me give
where
you another
we will
really
be sovereign.
Okay.
So what you
let
are
me
doing
give you another really critical
what
area.
you're doing is manufacturing a sense of fake. What's
no,
the
no,
word? Fake or even mock outrage. When in fact,
I'm not outraged. I'm just asking you questions. Let me ask you.
No, but what you're doing is you're
affecting
that outrage.
I'm not affecting any kind of... I'm not outraged at all. I'm just asking questions. Let me ask you a question about another really critical area, which is free movement of people.
Yes.
We have this new labour mobility system. Can you answer a question the Prime Minister couldn't answer? Will, going forward, EU citizens have special rights under that system?
We'll decide who has special rights. There's a parallel here with fisheries. Some people imagine that when we take back control of our waters, that means that no European boat will ever enter our seas. No. European boats will enter our seas, but on our terms. In the same way, ending free movement doesn't mean that no European citizen will ever make their way into the UK, but it means that we can decide on our terms.
Will there be visas?
It will be up to us to decide what our immigration policy is.
What it's going to be like. Will there be visas?
It's a matter for this government to decide what the future migration policy should be. That's what taking back control means.
If I'm a raspberry farmer in Blairgowrie and I'm employing people from Latvia at the moment to pick my raspberries, under this system, will I see much difference?
Well, one of the things that we want to do to help raspberry growers in Blairgowrie and across the country is to make sure that we can have an appropriate scheme in order to help them get workers on a seasonal basis. We're working out what some of the details of that might be. But the important thing is, outside the European Union, we can decide, in consultation with industry and through Parliament, who comes to this country and on what terms. We will have control of our migration policy. And it's a big difference, because you used the F word earlier, a particular four-letter F word, fake. And in using that, I think a case in point is the sovereignty that we will have over migration. At the moment, any citizen of the EU has a right to come here entirely freely as a matter of EU law. As a result of our being outside the EU, we will be able to say, no,
Sure.
we decide who comes here and on what terms.
Now, you most unfairly accused me of confecting outrage a moment ago. Let me read you some real outrage. This is something that's been passed around the European Reform Group, of which you're well aware.
Fine body of men and women.
Well, this is what the fine body of men and women have been sharing with each other. These proposals lead directly to a worst of all worlds black hole Brexit, where the UK is stuck permanently as a vassal state in the EU's legal and regulatory tar pit, still has to obey EU laws and ECJ rulings across the vast areas, as we discussed, cannot develop an effective international trade policy or adapt our economy to take advantage of the freedom of Brexit, and has lost its vote and treaty vetoes as an EU member state. They think you have sold them out.
Well, it's a vivid piece of writing from one individual, but I have to respectfully disagree. How can it be the case that we are stuck in a regulatory tar pit when we can determine not just migration policy, but also, in a huge swathe of our economy, we have perfect autonomy, and also Parliament can decide, if new rules come forward, to reject them. So I admire the...
You're not polishing a stool, are you?
No, I'm sitting on a very handsome orange chair. One of the things about this agreement, and I should say one of the things about that text, is that text has a highly coloured, vivid, almost Dickensian...
The kind of thing that you used to say yourself.
No, not at all. I don't think I could have written nearly as well as that. But, however powerfully written it is, I fear that it misses the point and it's short of the mark. That in all of the important areas where an independent country chooses to exercise sovereignty, Britain will be able to do so, and in so doing will be respecting the referendum result and the mandate that we were given.
So is your message to those colleagues wondering about what to do next? This isn't perfect, isn't absolutely what I would have wanted, but it is by far the best we can possibly get now.
Yes, critically, we have got to ensure that this country leaves the European Union in March 2019. Now, there are two people I noticed who've been very unhappy with this deal. Nick Clegg on the one hand, Nigel Farage on the other. Nick Clegg's unhappy with this deal because he doesn't want us to leave. Nigel Farage is unhappy with this approach because he wants this government to fail so that he can cry betrayal for his own reasons. All those of us who believe that we want to execute a proper Brexit and one that is the best deal for Britain have an opportunity now to get behind the Prime Minister in order to negotiate that deal. There's one other thing as well that was agreed at Chequers, one really important thing, which is we're being generous towards the EU. We're showing flexibility. If the EU is ungenerous and inflexible, then we may have to contemplate walking away without a deal. And one of the things that we agreed at Chequers is that we would step up the preparations for precisely that outcome. And civil servants and ministers across government have been working hard in order to ensure that
I know lots of people are working hard. Can I ask you a very straightforward question?
A critical question is that we will be in a position in March 2019, if we don't get the deal that we want, to be able to walk away.
Are we actually in a position to walk away now?
We need to be by March 2019.
So we're not.
We need to be. The Cabinet have agreed that we're going to take the preparations. No one wants to walk away now because we're in the middle of a negotiation. What we need to do is to be able to walk away in March 2019.
How many extra customs officials have we hired?
We are in the process of hiring a significant number of people. In my own department, I'm not the Minister in charge of Customs, we've hired a significant number of people in order to prepare for just that eventuality.
Are there any extra lorry parks or warehouses waiting to deal with no deal?
We have made an investment in infrastructure. We've got the legislation ready. We've got the people ready. There is more to do. The critical thing is we need to be ready by March 2019, and the Prime Minister authorised the Cabinet to step up those preparations, not because we want that outcome. I don't want that outcome. I want a deal, and I think what the Prime Minister is putting forward succeeds in making sure that we end ECJ jurisdiction, we end freedom of movement, and we have the regulatory autonomy we need in the areas that are important to make this economy a success in the future.
If Barnier looks at this and says, I can push Britain a little bit more towards the EEA, to full membership of the Customs Union and the single market, what's your message to him?
My message to Michel Barnier is that I have enormous respect for you, Michel. I know that you're going to negotiate hard, but it's in the interests of French farmers, French industry, and French citizens that we continue to have good trading relationships. Make sure that you regard the interests of your citizens with the same care and the same attention as our Prime Minister has the interests of our citizens.
One final question. You were co-convener of Vote Leave. At any stage, were you aware of working jointly with the campaign Believe, who got £600,000 of public money quite late in the campaign?
No.
Do you believe that you have broken electoral law?
No.
If the Electoral Commission conclude that you have broken electoral law, how will you act?
That's a hypothetical question. But one of the key things about the...
Not very.
Well, it is, actually. One of the key things about the Electoral Commission report, which the BBC, I know, managed to get a readout of earlier this week, is that I haven't read it. You haven't read it, Andrew. Let's wait for it to be published. And I know that Vote Leave are going to challenge that in the courts. I think it would be wrong for me as a government minister to preempt that process by... I love answering questions that you offer as pithily as possible, but this is one area where...
This is not terribly evident today, but thank you.
No, well, I think the previous two ones I did answer with one syllable and only two letters. The critical thing here is that both of us have to respect the legal process, because that's one of the things about Britain. Our rule of law, our common law system, which will be enhanced as we leave the European Union, is one of the glories of our constitution.
And respect for the clock. Michael Gove, we've run out of time. Thanks very much indeed. Now...